Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Glacier Book Club. I got to tell you, my name is Doug Mitchell, and I could not be more excited about tonight. I have been looking forward to this book club ever since I read John Clayton's incredible book over a year ago now. I have so many pages of notes of questions for John, but I promise this is going to be, as it always is, a book club driven conversation. We're just so delighted to have John Clayton with us, joining us from beautiful downtown Roscoe, Montana, where he is at River Arts and Books, which is a super special place in that community. It's interesting, when I was preparing for tonight, I learned a little about John. I learned a little about River Arts and Books. And Caroline, thank you for helping get this all put together at your place there. And at River Arts and Books, they talk about being about place, literature, and community. And John talks about being at the intersection of history, nature, and culture. And so I feel like we have a really powerful thing going on in this Power of Place with an incredible author, historian, who has been writing about the outdoors and our special places for a long, long time. John's been in Montana for more than 3 decades. He wasn't born here, but he got here sure as fast as he could. And we are the beneficiaries of his writing, not only as a journalist and as a book writer, but also I will really highly recommend that you look at John's Substack. And it's really terrific. It's a weekly article, and it's a really great way to stay up to date on lots of things and everything John Clayton. So John, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. What a thrill. I was really gratified when you invited me, and it's even nicer to see all you people here. Thank you.
And there's a live audience there at River Arts, and so that's great. We've done this a couple of times. And if you have any trouble hearing me, folks there, you give John the high sign, and I can use my outside voice. As I said, I was really taken by this book. I am not a historian by any stretch of the imagination, but I love history, and I think this confluence of two amazing stories of Muir and Pinchot is really, really powerful. And I want to kind of explore a little bit before we get into the book. Kind of talk to us a little bit about your journey from being a New England, Massachusetts, Williams College guy to coming out west.
Well, there was a moment in 1990 when I was on vacation in Yellowstone National Park, and I realized that I hated my job. I hated living in a city. All my friends had moved away. It was time for a big change. And then during the course of that vacation, I decided to come out west. And I had always wanted to be a writer, and I imagined that I was going to write a best-selling novel and then move to a small town in the mountains. And then I was like, well, wait a minute. Maybe I could just make the move first, and then I don't have to worry about whether or not I'm ever a bestseller. And that was a very, very wise move. So yeah, I've been here ever since.
And how did you choose Montana in general, and then specifically that beautiful Beartooth area where you're located?
We had friends of the family when I was growing up in Massachusetts who had lived here and talked about it. I had a good friend at Williams who had lived in Cody, Wyoming, and talked about the Beartooths. And so I was always curious about this area. But then it just happened to be that, I was here on vacation. I happened to fly into Billings instead of into Bozeman or Jackson or Cody or somewhere. And so, yeah, I ended up in the Beartooths.
So I had dinner last night. I had the privilege of having dinner with the board and staff of Defenders of Wildlife, who are in town in Glacier having their annual board meeting. And one of the folks I was having dinner with last night suggested a great question. So I'm going to start with that tonight. You've clearly done a lot of these events and over time, particularly regarding natural rivals. what's the question that you hoped somebody would ask that no one's asked yet?
The question that all writers want people to ask is about process. Why did I structure the book this way? What's my philosophy of endnotes? The time that I spent writing, I was often answering questions about process. But we never get those questions because no one else really cares.
That's interesting. I'm very interested in process, and so I'm gonna ask a couple of those questions.
Okay, great.
I have my son had had an author who's published a couple of books, and his process is to write it on the computer, send it to his publisher, and then delete it so that when they send it back, he has to retype it again. I know others who write by hand. I know people who use an old typewriter. When you're actually writing, what is there a process that you use, and did you get to that process in some particular fashion?
So I'm an intensive outliner. I know what's going to happen, and so in terms of the literal writing, yeah, I just sit down at the computer and I start banging it out. And obviously, there's going to be a lot of editing that happens after that. But to me, the exciting part of the process, the important part, is as I am structuring the story, as I'm choosing which episode will come when, so that we can build from an initial question or problem to a final answer or solution.
And talk to us a little bit about what were the challenges? I mean, there's a lot of Muir information, there's a lot of Pinchot information. What were the challenges of getting information that dovetailed together so that you could tell this remarkable story?
It was, to me, a huge structural problem, a timeline problem, because the way most people tell the story, you go sort of chronologically until the end of Muir's life. And at the end of Muir's life, he had an argument with Pinchot, and he lost that argument and he died. And it's almost as if Pinchot killed him. And so, well, of course, we're going to see these people as enemies. I wanted to emphasize the collaborations they did earlier in their life. So I had to figure out how to end my book in the 1890s, even though I was covering events that would go through at least 1914.
And as you point out, the lots of collaboration between the two, but that didn't mean that there was agreement necessarily between the two, even on the fundamental question of what should be the purpose of a national park, right? There's an underlying conflict between the Muir view of kind of spiritualism and individualism and the sustainability view of a Pinchot. Were they able to just kind of not ignore that until later in life, that major difference, or do you think they dealt with that over time?
It's not just that they had different views of public lands. They were remarkably different people. When they first met, boy, Muir is much older, less educated, more of a sort of a wanderer. Pinchot, very ambitious, coming from an urban background, a very patrician background. It's really remarkable that they became friends at all. And yet they did sort of bond over a love of the natural world. And although they disagreed maybe about how to use that natural world or how to appreciate it, the fact that they were both interested, I think, was the key to all of the agreements that they were able to forge, and perhaps also a key to them not being as angry at each other as some of their disciples later claimed they were.
And you used the word disciples. One of the other things I was taken by in your book, and also in a Doris Kearns Goodwin book I read recently about Theodore Roosevelt, is each of them seemed to have connections with newspapers and publishers, and that there seems to be during that time more involvement of the press in these larger landscape issues. Um, does that ring for you in terms of how you looked at this era?
It really does. I've written a bit about this era, and it's fascinating to me because of the rise of newspapers and especially the penny press. You had a lot of newspapers reaching out to the middle classes and lower classes. It wasn't just sort of something that the elites were reading. And so I think that involved a huge shift in cultural values. And we sometimes talk about things like the Spanish-American War being largely driven by the Hearst press and their desire to sell newspapers by stirring up anger against the Spanish. And I think that same sort of dynamic was happening with the press and environmental issues. You had suddenly lots more people being involved, and maybe being involved in different ways, being involved emotionally and not just sort of with dry facts.
And the publishers themselves would get involved. I think at one point in the book you write about Underwood Johnson, traveling with Muir to Yosemite, and you've got, folks from Harper's and from the Atlantic and from McClure's, that there was a more direct involvement of the publishers, who might have been the owners too. You would know of those at that time. I was taken by that because it seems so different from where we are today with independent journalism.
So yeah, I think in the 1890s, journalists had not yet formed this idea of the view from nowhere, of an insistence on impartiality. Even in the 1920s, H.L. Mencken, was reported on the Scopes trial, but also in the background was sort of engineering it. And so I think you see a lot of that with a lot of these publications that these guys are associated with in the 1890s. It's only later in the 20th century that we have this alleged ideal of impartial journalism. And I think right now what we're seeing is new media, new forms of journalism causing interesting new ways for people to interact. And it's a struggle. I mean, it's really hard, but it was hard in the 1890s as well.
Yeah, we have to, we are constantly iterating as a country. I think that's, something about the American experiment, right? That we're going to celebrate the 250th anniversary of this country, and we've done a lot of iteration. We're with John Clayton, joining us from River Arts in Roscoe, Montana. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize the best team in the business of the Glacier Conservancy, Andrew Smith, Gracie Regala, and Amy Lucky. Amy is populating the chat with questions. Feel free to put questions in the chat, and I'll turn it over here to Amy in a bit. Gracie's also going to choose some winners, contest winners. We're going to give away 2 books tonight. One is we're having a Glacier conversation, not a book club, but a conversation with Chris Latrace, who remarkable book, Becoming Little Shell. Chris is also the Montana's Poet Laureate for 2025. An amazing story, amazing person. And then we're also going to give away, I'm going to give you a little teaser. We're going to give away a copy of the first book for 2026. They are chosen, but not yet announced. So this is John Taliaferro's great book on George Bird Grinnell. So we're going to give away a copy of that as well. John Clayton, you talk about Muir. I mean, and maybe I'm putting words in, but you refer to Muir as a prophet, or his own view of being a prophet. And in that view, it seemed to me that maybe the Sierra Club was his congregation, if he were a prophet, and if so, did he lose his congregation with Hetch Hetchy?
Oh, not at all. I think Hetch Hetchy helped the congregation thrive. I mean, I don't want to make too many blasphemous comparisons, but a prophet dying or a prophet struggling is not necessarily the end of that prophet's influence. We did not have a rapture yesterday, but I think the people who believed in that rapture, their belief is not necessarily less. Hetch Hetchy offered Muir an opportunity to speak his mind fully, to make his case as strongly as possible, and the fact that he lost that argument. I mean, I would argue that people like Steve Mather got involved in the National Park Service, in organizing that National Park Service in response to Hetch Hetchy. That Mather was alongside Muir in fighting for that valley. When they lost, they realized they needed a bigger, better organization to fight for national parks. And Mather created the Park Service, which was the most successful arm of the government through the 20th century.
So before I switch over to Amy, and I've got two more questions that are going to go in a little bit of a different direction, kind of a more, I'm going to develop a personal connection here with them. You write about Pinchot's most treasured childhood memory, I think it's a quote, of catching his first fish on a fly. What is your most treasured childhood memory?
Ooh, so we had in the 1970s, my family did a lot of car camping. We had a red VW wagon with a little pop-up top that the kids would sleep in. And the first night of every camping trip, we got to eat a meal that we never got to eat at home, which was a can of Dinty Moore meatball stew.
Nice.
I have never dared eat it as an adult.
I like it. And maybe people can put those in the chat. Mine is not dissimilar in terms of, you remember, we're of the same age. Do you remember the little boxes of cereals that came in like a group of 10? Right. That was that was the treat for us every year. The camping trip to Butt Lake in California, and I kid you not, it's not Butte Lake, it's Butt Lake. That was our thing. So if you want to share that in the chat, that could be kind of fun. The second one is, I think in here, Muir carried 3 books with him: the Bible, Burns, and Milton. So what are your 3?
So my 3 would be a little more obscure than Muir's. I would carry around Common Ground by J. Anthony Lucas. It's the story of forced busing in Boston in the 1970s. I lived through that process and I did not understand it. Only through the power of nonfiction narrative did I come to sort of appreciate what was going on in my own life. The second book would be T.R. Pearson's novel, A Short History of a Small Place, which is an account of a sort of a made-up history of a small town in North Carolina. Hilarious book. Most of the humor comes from Pearson's use of language, and so I keep going back to that book for the wonders of language and for the wonders of community in this small town. And my third book would be Mark Sprague's memoir, Where Rivers Change Direction. Mark is in the room tonight. Mark grew up on a dude ranch outside of Yellowstone in the 1960s, and his stories of connecting to that landscape and those creatures and those people speaks to me as someone who also wants to connect to the landscape in Greater Yellowstone.
Yeah, it's books have such a powerful place in our lives and our psyches in our homes. I think it's it's one of the reasons when we were in the pandemic, I decided to start the Glacier Book Club, where we were all in our basements. We were all starving for connection. I knew that I had this built-in community of people who cared about Glacier. And, I think 42 books later, we're still, having a really great set of interactions. And it's thanks to authors like you who are willing to come and join us for an hour. So thank you.
Thank you for starting that tradition. What a wonderful, wonderful thing to do.
Yeah, it's a fun thing. And speaking of fun, they don't come much more fun than Amy Lucky. Amy, I know you've got some questions in the chat, so I thought I might hand it off to you for a minute or two.
Awesome. Wow, that seems like a lot to live up to. And Doug, I think you have struck a chord. I need to know which of the 10 cereals was your favorite. Was it the
So
first?
Kristen, I'm 100% with you. My older brother always got the Frosted Flakes, and it just isn't fair because we didn't have sugared cereal in our household, and so I still resent him for that. But yeah, cocoa, no, the
Wasn't a box of
sugar pops. I think that was the next
Oh,
good one. But
okay. Nice. John, I like to put some people on the spot because we have such willing participants here on Book Club. But Dave Baylor had a great comment, and Dave, I was wondering if you would unmute and maybe share your comment with John.
John, it was one of the most impressive and comprehensive and interesting books in the 5 or 6 years I've been participating in the book club. And I could relate to it because I read Tim Egan's, one of my local authors, Tim Egan's book, The Big Burn, a few years ago, because I go through Montana and Idaho every year to go to living here in Seattle, I had to stop in Wallace and see exactly where that fire stopped. But he talked so much about the Pinchot TR relationship, and it drove me that discussion in the end of your book, which I thought was really well structured. Yeah, and I think they agreed on much more than they disagreed upon from the way you've written it. So yeah, but the extent to which Pinchot, by his organizational skills, developed his acolytes who became the forest rangers. And Egan pointed out that they referred to themselves as little GPs, so as did a lot of other people. So I really enjoyed the book, and I enjoyed the background on the spiritual emphasis of each of those people and the way they looked at the world too. That's something that's often overlooked and is good for us to understand. So thanks for the book.
Thank you. Yeah, I too read The Big Burn when it first came out and had to visit Wallace to see what was where that setting was. And I think in writing this book, I realized that, what Pinchot was able to do to create the little GPs was simply to bring in people from his fraternity at Yale. Mm-hmm. And he knew that they would think the same way he did. They were forestry majors. They had the same background that he did. And our challenge today is so much harder because we realize the value of diversity. We need to have people who are not just all from the same Yale fraternity so that we can have different perspectives on these issues. And yet we need to somehow build that teamwork among them. So I think today's leaders have a much bigger challenge than Pinchot did.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Dave, for being here and for being willing to unmute and join us. And thanks for your answer, John. So this one is sort of along the same lines. It's from Eric and Tanya, who are also longtime book clubbers. They wanted to know many of the conservationists of that area were very wealthy, Pinchot, Roosevelt, Grinnell, and that contrasts sharply with Muir. How do you think that he became, and I think he must be talking about Pinchot, become so effective despite the luxury of not having to worry about an income?
I think I'm not sure that effectiveness and income necessarily correlate. Muir came from relative poverty and was effective. Pinchot came from relative wealth and was effective. Plenty of Pinchot's contemporaries were less effective, and I'm sure there were all sorts of other Wisconsin farm boys who didn't have Muir's effectiveness. Money and class are certainly interesting subjects, important to American history. I wanted to dive in and find as many answers as I could. I'm not sure I found that many answers. It was certainly valuable for each of them to collaborate with people from different backgrounds and of different classes. Presumably they were listening and learning. But beyond that, I'm not sure that I gained a lot of wisdom about how to tackle those issues.
Great, thank you. And then we have another one from Doug Bonham. Oftentimes we have 2 or 3 Dougs on here, but Doug is with us tonight. Doug, would you be willing to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, I have a question for John, but I can't help squeeze a plug in for GNPC. I just came from Science and History Day down in at park headquarters. They have it every year. My work takes me to a lot of science conferences, and I go to whole conferences where I can't even hear a single paper that is half as interesting as every single one of those GNPC funded research projects that were presented today. So thank you for that fabulous work that you do.
Thanks, Doug.
But for John, I'm hoping, can you compare and contrast the role that basic science education played into the two philosophies that came from those two guys?
Yeah, interesting question. You know, Muir had very little formal education, raised on the farm. He escaped to University of Wisconsin, but was studying engineering as much as anything. Whereas Pinchot had the full Exeter, Yale, Europe suite of trainings. To me, what was impressive about both of them was their willingness to take those ideas out in the field. For Muir to be wandering around the Yosemite Valley and looking up and asking, how did this valley get formed? That allowed him to come up with the theory of glaciation, which many scientists of the time mocked him for. He didn't have it exactly right, but he had it probably closer to right than they did. And so that came from observation as much as classroom learning. Likewise, you know, Pinchot actually left his studies in Europe early. People thought he should have stayed 4 to 6 years. He stayed less than 2 because he wanted to apply these forestry skills on the ground, as it were. And he later sort of regretted it. He said, yeah, it would have been nice to have more knowledge. But at the same time, I think there's a certain practicality to the American character that takes that education out into the world, and so has a little balance of both the classroom and the nature.
Super interesting. So I think I've covered, oh, here comes a question from Kristen. Kristen, would you be willing to unmute and ask your question?
Kristen, I'm not sure you're unmuted yet. I'm sorry, Kristen, I'm not able to hear. Can you check the unmute again?
I think she's working on it. Can see her. I can ask for Kristen. Kristen, you work on it, and if you want to jump in, go right ahead. Kristen writes, my favorite part was on pages 108 and 109, where you discuss Muir's philosophy of nature, spiritual and moral, and his desire to share them with others. I'm in the woods, and they are me. And that's how she feels in Glacier National Park. So I guess not a question, just a statement. But Kristen, what a nice thing to say.
Right.
I think most of us on this call would agree with you.
Yes. Yeah.
I found unmute. Yes, I found unmute. I'm sorry. Thank you for reading it for me, Amy. That was just it just described how I've been struggling to describe that for myself and why I moved back and now work for the Conservancy.
And we are very happy about it.
I must admit, when I jumped into this project, I was a little bit afraid. I had not known Muir well, only that he was involved in the Sierra Club and lots of political advocacy. I was worried, am I really going to spend 2 years with this guy? Aren't I going to get sick of him? And yet the joy and goodwill that he exuded in passages like that one made him surprisingly delightful for me to spend time with. And so that was one of the wonderful things about this project for me as well.
Yeah.
Love it. So I think we have answered and read all the comments. John, I'm wondering if anybody in the room where you are has a question for you, or I don't want to forget about the in-person audience.
Yeah. They're not raising their hands.
All right. Well, if they don't yet, maybe they will later. I'm going to send it back over to Doug for probably more questions and some other fun.
Yeah, thanks. I think, and Gracie, I'm gonna talk a little bit about candy and how people can remember candy, and then maybe we'll go to you to give away a couple of books. As part of our book clubs, we always kind of have a moment for mission. And this week, instead of talking about a project, I'm going to talk a little bit about a person who's very special to us in the book club, and that's Candy Spear, who we lost to cancer, and Carl's with us tonight. As I mentioned earlier, as we were just getting together, they together have participated in 35 of the 42 book clubs that we've had, 60 plus digital events. And we're going to miss Candy terribly here at the Conservancy. And I know she's left a hole for Carl as well, but we have a way to remember people in Glacier National Park for whom Glacier is significant. And it's a Trees of Remembrance program that we are able to support the Native Plant Nursery and their desire to plant trees by remembering people by planting memorial trees for them. So if you'd like to help remember a fellow book clubber, Andrew's going to put a link in the chat. And if you want to give $5, if you want to give $500, doesn't matter. We will aggregate that and plant some trees in remembrance of our dear Candy. So thank you for thinking of that. And Carl, just know that you go with lots of love and condolences, and we'll look forward to seeing you here next spring or summer. And with that, Gracie, I know we've got a couple of books to give away, and if you would like to do that right now, that would be awesome.
Yeah, happy to. It a little bit fun. The two names have similar beginnings. Winning Becoming Little Shell, we have Michelle Spano, and then winning Grinnell, we have Mike Reiner. I'm probably pronouncing your last names wrong, and my apologies, but email info@glacier.org to claim your prize, as well as we have book plates for all. I sent John a bunch of blank book plates that he'll be signing, so if you want to get one of those, email info@glacier.org.
And thanks for doing that, John. And Mike Reiner, you owe me one since I hooked you up to the book club through our conversation earlier. So yeah, that's great. John Taliaferro is going to be a wonderful guest, and I can't wait to talk to Chris. Such a engaging person and a great writer, and an incredible story that I think is really important for us all to think about in this time. John Clayton, I want to go back to Muir a little bit. You talked about being able to spend time with Muir. I've read a bunch of stuff. This is a guy who had lots of diverse interests, right? I mean, it wasn't, if memory serves, like he jumped over his fence to go jump on a boat to go to Alaska to go look for people stuck in the ice, right? So you write about the Muir you knew in context of this story, but as you were doing that, you no doubt discovered other things Muir that didn't make it into the book. What are some of those Muir stories that caught your interest but didn't really connect with the story?
I forget now how much I was able to include in the book about Muir's 1,000-mile walk through the South, but it just stunned me. It was the late 1860s, just a couple of years after the Civil War ended, when he, a classic Northerner, decided to walk through the rural South across Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, down Kentucky first, down to Savannah. And so he's just sort of showing up in a tiny little village. Hey, do you mind if I sleep in your barn or in your farmyard? Does anyone have anything? I'll buy some groceries or buy a meal. And so, I mean, they must have just been shocked. Who is this guy? What is he thinking? And yet that was also really where he discovered a lot of natural wonder, a lot of plants that he wasn't familiar with. This was his first encounter with mountains, the Southern Appalachians in East Tennessee. And so one of the great thrills of my research was to go to East Tennessee and try and track down the first time that he'd encountered mountain foothills there, and actually follow in his footsteps a little bit. And, you know, meanwhile, me being the classic Northerner or Westerner, sort of wandering through small town Tennessee, talking to people about John Muir, you know, was a neat little pilgrimage for me as well.
Yeah, that's really cool. So we're the Glacier Book Club, so we're gonna kind of get into Glacier, and there's a great Glacier section in this book, and it's of course too short for my liking, and so I'm hoping maybe you can expand on some of those stories. But I don't think I have my date right. Was it late 1800s when he and Pinchot got together in Glacier, 1889, somewhere in that region. And as I remember the piece in your book, George Bird Grinnell kind of flies in and makes an appearance in that group. And of course, Grinnell's a whole nother set of stories. But so let's talk about that part a little bit. And I'm going to start with the question about what was Grinnell's role? Do you think he helped bring those two together? I mean, I don't know that there's a lot of there's a lot of documentation about it, but what was your sense about Grinnell's role in what I think was the first meeting between Pinchot and Muir?
So Pinchot and Muir first met, I think it was 1893 in New York City. But when they met on the shores of Lake McDonald in 1896, that was what got me going on this whole project. I read an account of that camping trip, and the little that I knew about Muir and Pinchot, I imagined them to be arguing the whole time. You know, perhaps Pinchot, this was before it was a national park. So perhaps Pinchot was looking up and saying, yeah, we could cut those trees first, and we put the dam over there. And Muir was saying, no, don't touch any of it. But that didn't happen. They both used the word delight to describe that encounter. And so that's what made me think, well, wait a minute, do I really know the story of Muir and Pinchot? Let me go read the dual biography. And I found it hadn't been written yet. And I'm like, well, maybe I have to write it then. But the book was always fueled by Glacier, by my experience in Glacier. I first visited Glacier in 1991, my very first summer in Montana. And I remember feeling a certain power on the shores of Lake McDonald, feeling like, yeah, this is a pretty place, but it also has some sort of spiritual depth, as if significant events have happened here. And so when I found this event and realized its significance, it was sort of like a homecoming for me that, yeah, you know, it turns out that so often we tell the history of Glacier around the railroad companies, around outdoor recreation, or around the indigenous tribes. But here is a way that Glacier is representative of national parks and public lands as a whole, nationwide. You know, for many years in Yellowstone, they had an entire museum dedicated to the founding of the National Park Service, or founding of the first national park there at Madison Junction, when Cornelius Hedges allegedly said, maybe we should keep this land in trust for the nation. And yet there's something similar actually happened in Glacier. And I imagined this book as sort of the equivalent of that shrine at Madison Junction, to say, hey, yeah, public lands are so important to so many Americans, and they arose out of a collaboration that reached its peak here on the shores of Lake McDonald, here at this place that is just as special as Madison Junction and Yellowstone. So yeah, it was really profound.
And I think that you know, I was just taken by that section of the book, because it's about Glacier, but it's so evocative, right? Because it's the time when Muir hikes up to Avalanche Lake. So we can blame him, I guess, for the fact that everybody goes to Avalanche Lake now. But you know, and writes about time spent in Glacier is not taken away from your life, right? You kind of, as I was reading that part of your book, I'm kind of watching your walking back to Lake McDonald Lodge in double time, recommitted to this idea, and then coming across this fellow George Bird Grinnell, who has this love of this particular landscape, and I think, to your good point, this depth of understanding of the special things that have happened there over 10,000 years under the stewardship of the Native American people who have stewarded the land and had many special moments there. So does Grinnell an important player here in that relationship, or just kind of a bit player? What's your sense?
What fascinated me about Grinnell was his relationship to Charles Sargent. Sargent was the chair of the commission that Muir and Pinchot were sitting on when they visited Glacier. Sargent was a very difficult person, very sort of a know-it-all, old school Harvard professor who had definite ideas about how he wanted public lands to play out. And as I was looking for ways to try to like Charles Sargent, I came across his connection with Grinnell and the fact that the two of them together in the 1880s had started talking about the value of setting aside Glacier as a national park, that it was such a special place. And so I was able to bring in Grinnell as a collaborator of Sargent. And then I felt that Grinnell was so important to the history of Glacier, and this, if this book has a single place where it's rooted, it's certainly in Glacier. I did feel a need to tell a little bit of the story of Glacier, I think, just as a preview for your work next year with John Tollifer. That's absolutely a magnificent biography that he did of Grinnell, and it highlights some of the tensions that Grinnell had with the indigenous people, and the wonderful stewardship they had of this land, and yet his belief that somehow his tribe would do it better. Those were the tensions surrounding the founding of public lands. So I didn't find a lot of evidence of Grinnell and Muir or Pinchot actually interacting, but Grinnell's relationship to the place, I felt was important, a story worth telling.
Yeah, I you know, my evocative nature, just that I've read a lot about, as many of us have, about Grinnell, and you know, he cared so much about the landscape and the people and the history of that it felt like he could be additive to this discussion, with an academic and another spiritual person in the discussion. So about the same time, a little later in the book, you know, you talk about the no trespassing crowd, right? And you know, it seems as if that, to your point about understanding the 10,000-year history, it seems like that's just completely ignorant of that history, right? There's been trespassing for a long time, and we're better for it. Was there really a lot of ignorance during that time about the Native American historical stewardship of Glacier, of the parks?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there was a stunning amount of ignorance. And John Muir, you know, I should mention, has been called to task over the last 5 years, since my book was published, called to task for his racially insensitive comments about Native Americans, about Black people, about all sorts of other issues. You know, my response to that was, Yeah, boy, it's really uncomfortable to read some of Muir's comments today because he was such a product of his times, and those times indeed involved a great deal of ignorance and stereotyping and overlooking of the profound legacy of the people who had managed these lands in a way that we found beautiful. So yeah, I took issue with some of the ways that Grinnell dealt with some of the indigenous people. I also had to take issue with Muir. Pinchot was also on the outskirts of the eugenics movement at the time. It's stunning how many societal values they had back then that we don't have today.
It's a complicated time. It's a complicated history. We just are finishing a project restoring the Senator Burton K. Wheeler cabin on the north shore of Lake McDonald, and that's a complicated history. But I think we're getting better at telling all of the history and then letting those pieces fall where they may. Amy Lucky, I see that we've got a couple of more questions in the chat. Maybe I'll hand it over to you for a minute, but please reserve me a couple of minutes for my speed round.
Of course, of course. So we have a development in the giveaway world. Michelle, who was so tickled to have won, that's what in her words, but she already has the book Becoming Little Shell. So Michelle, we still want you to connect with us, please, at info.glacier.org, and we will get you, info@glacier.com, and we will get you, did I say that wrong?
info@glacier.org.
.org, thank you. info@glacier.org. My comms and orgs. So Michelle, we're going to get you a different book, but we would like to award to give away the Chris Latre book to Barbara Hessler, I believe is your last name. So Barbara, if you could also connect with us at info@glacier.org, we would appreciate it. And let me scroll down here a little bit, John. We have some comments and some questions. So Sue wanted to tell you that she loved the book. These men were so courageous and relentless against all odds. She appreciates the questions John asks her reader in the conclusion, what does nature mean to me? And for her, it's her compass. She learned so much. She wanted to say thanks, and thanks to the Conservancy, which is a great question to also pose to the chat. If folks want to write about what does nature mean to them, that would be fun to read. Kathy Wyatt asked a question that you sort of touched on, John. I think when you found out about the meeting of Pinchot and Muir on Lake McDonald sort of inspired you to write the book. So that was her question. What inspired you to choose this topic? And how long did you research to gather all the facts that you share? She felt like your book was truly fascinating.
It was about a 2.5 year process between my previous book, Wonder Landscape, about Yellowstone, and Natural Rivals, which is almost as fast as I've ever written a book. Things came together surprisingly, maybe not easily, but surprisingly productively for this book. So we do have a question in the room here as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, I had a chance to take my kids to both Glacier, and we always go to Yellowstone. It was the first time I've been in a while, and I don't know the inner workings like the Conservancy does around what it means to manage those places now. But just as like a lay person, I question how are we going to manage this, especially since COVID. I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially after seeing these two much different perspectives.
So could folks hear that question? She visited both Yellowstone and Glacier this summer with her kids and wondered about the management of it and how that can go forward. I suspect that, Doug, you're going to have some great perspectives on Glacier. I would say that from my perspective, writing this book, what struck me is how much more difficult it is to do that management now than it was back in the time of Muir and Pinchot. For example, they didn't really have any concept of ecology. That whole branch of science didn't come around until Aldo Leopold in the 1920s and 30s. They also didn't have to manage for the diversity or volume of visitors that we have now. And so I think that management task has gotten 10 times or 100 times more complicated. We have a few more tools now. We have a lot more education. We have a lot more institutions such as the Conservancy. But yeah, I mean, my admiration goes out to these folks every day. Doug, do you want to add
Yeah, I
anything?
think it's a great question, and I think we're meeting a difficult moment right now as what we see that budgets have been flat in the National Park Service for a long time while visitation has doubled, and expenses have gone up, and so we're getting less from they're having to do more for less. We're trying to fill in that gap. 12 years ago, we provided a 6% lift to the park's operating budget. This year, we'll provide a 26% lift to the operating budget. Of 13 wilderness staff members, we pay for 11 of them. So groups like ours used to provide the margin of excellence. We're now providing the margin of survival. So there is a funding question, but within that, it really is, to your good point, a lot about visitation, right? That Grinnell wrote somewhere around 1916 that he'd ruined the park by making it a park because they had 6,000 visitors, and now the place was just overrun with people, right? And so with 3.1 million, or average of 3 million the last 4 years, those there is a carrying capacity for a national park, and we're at it or above it. And there's going to be a serious challenge to prevent degradation. And that is currently in conflict with what appears to be the current policy imperative to reduce support for parks. And so I think that's going to be a really interesting moment for all of us to deal with. It's why I have no hair and it's gray. But we'll get there. I mean, we have the people who work in green and gray didn't just want a job. These are people who dreamed of being in green and gray since they were 10 years old. They're in it to win it, and they're going to work really hard, and we're going to be by their side, and the public is with this. This is America's best idea, and we're not going to let it go by the wayside. Okay, so Amy, I'm going to go speed round.
Do it.
You okay with that?
Yep. Got
Okay,
it.
so buckle up, Buttercup. Here we go. So I think there's a piece in the book early on about the Celtics. And I don't mean people from overseas. So I'm going to make you choose Celtics center. We have Walton or Parrish.
Russell.
Well, that's not a choice, John. I mean, you didn't know. I'm not going to ask you Pinchot or Muir, because that would be choosing your favorite. Well, okay, you got Walton or Parrish.
Walton.
Yeah, okay, because Russell is the easy answer. Okay, so Emerson or Thoreau? They weren't Celtics, by the way. I know.
Emerson.
Emerson. Okay, you almost went through Thoreau there. So it's the bottom of the ninth in the World Series. The game is tied. You have one batter. Bases are loaded. Darrell Evans or Big Papi?
Papi.
Papi, okay. I understand that perhaps you make a home brew. Maybe there's something waiting in the bathtub as we speak. Am I likely to get an IPA or a Kolsch?
You're likely to get a porter, but
okay,
more than IPA.
Okay, all right. Well, I'd like that third answer. Okay, and with that, thank you for playing our game. Thank you for letting us know a little bit more about you. And I'm going to ask one more question about this book, which is, well, I'm going to ask you a different question. What's next?
I'd like to return to Yellowstone. I don't yet have a contract for this book, but I'm working on a book that I call The Autobiography of Yellowstone. Auto-biography, how cars continue to change our natural treasure. Yellowstone admitted cars in 1915, and I would argue that totally transformed the visitor experience. And I was fortunate to write a lengthy review recently of Ben Goldfarb's book, Crossings, which is about the new science of road ecology, where scientists are realizing that animals actually respond to roads and have been doing so for decades in ways that is actually changing, I would argue, the ecological makeup of Yellowstone. And so to tell that story from 1915 to the present is a fun way for me to dig into some more national park history.
Yeah, that's awesome. Dave Romer, who's our superintendent, when he gets congestion issues, kind of says, so Going to Sun Road built 1933, 135,000 visitors that year. It's exactly the same road today, except it's paved. There's a huge change that comes with this whole auto culture as we move from trains to cars and on from there. So I am so thankful for the time tonight. I wish I were with you guys down at River Arts and Books. Trust me, next time I'm in the neighborhood, I'm going to come down and darken your door. John Clayton, you're an extraordinary writer and extraordinary Montanan. I really encourage folks to get on the Substack, subscribe. It's a great, I think it's Wednesdays. Tuesday. Okay, shows up my email box. I look forward to it every week. And to everybody at the Glacier Book Club, thank you for another wonderful evening of sharing together. I look forward to these all the time. We have only one more this year, and that's going to be Grizzly Confidential, which is a neat, interesting kind of experiential journalist book by a former park ranger about grizzly bears. And so that's always fun to talk about grizzly bears. And John, thanks again, and know that you've got lots of family up here in Glacier.
Thank you so much for hosting. Thanks everyone for coming. This has been a delight.
Thanks so much. Thanks everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks, John.